We have to wait until everybody is ready. Lalit, what's happening at the back?
Yes.
Actually, it's not streaming online right now.
Oh, we have streaming online issue. All right. So let's get underway then. What I'd like to do is to use the time we have. Is I ask Dr. Chhibber to just cover the broad themes. Now there are many very interesting themes. He went through in some detail yesterday in his talk, his distinguished lecture, in some detail. I'd ask him to take about 15 minutes and do a broad, just kind of intro into those broad themes as to what is shackling India in his view, and therefore if removed, would unshackle India. Of course, his work is largely economic, and one might argue that there is no way you can unshackle India economically if you did not unshackle India culturally, socially, ecologically, and so on. And it reminds me of a book I had read a few years ago entitled Alternative Futures. I think it was Lotari and Joy. And their subtitle of their book was also Unshackling India. And so it'd be interesting to see and hear the conversation if we just focus on the small economic system, which some people believe it is the entire world of any country. I don't. But let's hear first from the author himself as to what are the broad themes, Ajay, that you believe, if addressed, will help us to understand the hard truths and the clear choices for economic revival. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Naresh. And so yesterday, of course, I did expound quite a lot on the major themes of the book. And so at the second bite at the apple, I thought perhaps I'll dig a little deeper into the concept of unshackling India and run through, not again all the 6 themes I laid out yesterday, but perhaps to ask the question, what kind of holds us back. But just before I do that, let me say that I talked a little bit yesterday about how an economy is like a bus, different bits of moving parts, and probably explained why we need to think more systemically rather than think of health policy and education policy and financial policy and tax policy or labor or land or capital, how these things come together to produce certain outcomes, right? I think we talked a little bit about that yesterday. And one of the things that, if you worked a lot like me outside of India and inside India, what strikes you is that whenever you come back to India and you say, well, such and such country has tried to address this problem in this way, and perhaps India should think about that, the answer I would generally get at least, and maybe others did too, particularly in the bureaucracy, would be, well, India is very different, culturally, socially, politically, and it's this is not going to work here. And then you say, no, but in all these other countries too, they are very different. But some broad themes do work. If you try to do conditional cash transfers, or you think of certain types of banking regulation, it's not that different. In the end, human beings respond in very similar ways to incentives. Now, it's true that India is different. Its history is different, culture is different, and institutions may also be framed differently. But we have to take these ideas that have worked and then apply them in some local situation in a particular way. But don't throw out the baby sort of with the bathwater. Don't throw out the idea itself. And of course, willy-nilly, you find in the end, India does come back to those solutions, and perhaps 10 years later. So one motivation of writing this book was, therefore, to say, where on all these themes is India today? You know, how do you benchmark India not only by looking at what we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 50 years ago or 75 years ago, which we do in this book. We go back to 1947 and start from there. And then we look 25 years ahead. But we do, in every chapter, benchmark where India stands. How much progress have we made and how much progress have others made? That was one theme that we wanted very much to put together in this book, in addition to this idea that there are systems that have to hang together. Now, the title of the book comes Unshackling India from the fact that we think that, and we lay out the case in this book, that the government is omnipresent. It's not a very large government. In fact, as the Dean, Mr. Mohan, is here, I would say there are too few officers in the foreign service even, right? I mean, India's foreign service is quite small relative to its global size and ambition and scale of its interaction globally. You have a very tiny foreign service. Similarly, you have very small very few teachers, we have very few doctors, we have very few judges, we have very few policemen. We have too many clerical staff, right? We also have this total spend that we do on government is not that large, but we spend it very badly in three ways. Number one, we are spending too little on health, education, even defense, the case I made yesterday, or now with the mother of all market failures, climate change. And even now, after the pandemic, if you see the health budget, it's still quite small, right? And now with China and Pakistan breathing down our borders, our defense spending, if you take out the pension bit, like I said yesterday, is actually the smallest it has been in the last 50 years as a share of GDP. So that's one unshackling or rearrangement we need to do, which is we need to refocus the government on those very vital necessities which a government should spend more and more effort on. The second point we make on unshackling is that it's too expensive because the public sector, while it is not performing well, 90 to 95% of the public sector wages, when you add in all the emoluments that you get. I remember when I was in government, I tried to find out how much money is spent maintaining my driver, and with all his benefits, probably his overtime and his housing. He was costing the government probably close to 50,000-60,000 rupees in a year. And today, you ask any private company and they will get people for even 20,000, very qualified people at 20,000, right? So you have 95% of government which is paid much higher than the private sector. And then the most discretionary part of government, where decisions are made, like you are secretary in the government, you are making enormous decision, for crores and monumental important decision making going on there with huge discretionary power. And you are making probably 1/20th what a counterpart in a private company would be making, right?
Adjunct.
Huh?
Adjunct professor.
Adjunct professor, yeah. So that's another thing we need to think about as to how were the government not so offices not so ugly to look at when you visit them. I would have called it a boutique government, small and very expensive, but I don't use that term because when you enter a government office, you hardly think of a boutique, right? Then the third thing is you say,
Each High Court judge has 22 people assigned.
yeah,
Watchman, gardener,
cook,
so on.
yeah, although entourage, yeah.
22.
Yeah. My salary when I was in the, I had the status of a minister of state. My salary was 50,000 rupees a month. 50,000 rupees a month. But then they gave me this house and a car.
Lodi estate.
Yeah, somewhere. Anyway, the third one that I point out is that the level at which we are spending is also very shackling in some sense, because we are spending too much at the center and at the state level and very little at the local level. I gave the example yesterday of China, where China spends more than 50% of its government expenditure is at the local level. Local meaning sarpanch, mayor, that level, not at the even the state capital level. In India, that number is 4% of GDP. So you can imagine that in a totalitarian authoritarian state, they are spending most of their money at local levels. So that's another aspect. Then when we started unpacking into the sectors, when we look at education, again you find the same phenomena, right? Most of the teachers are hired at the state level. They're not hired at the local level. So the salary scale that they are being paid in public schools is actually much higher than in the private schools. You'll have a private school run in 2 rooms with 3 shifts and 2 teachers with 80, 100 to 200 students coming out of there, probably with better outcomes than in a public school where the teacher half the time will not show up. But the salaries that they are paid are at state level salaries, much higher. And with very little learning outcomes. Of course, Delhi, in the AAP government, they've tried to improve things a bit, but we'll see what they do in Punjab now. So the same applies to the health sector again, So you run through these. So that's one kind of unshackling. Then we did very good 1991 reforms, but those reforms ran out of steam. Now we needed to move to the next stage of reforms, which means land, labor, capital. There you see how much intervention. So the intervention of the government is not just in terms of how much you spend or don't spend, but how you regulate and how you run, right? And there you find again massive intervention. There were about 100 labor laws. In fact, someone said, of course, yesterday I quoted Atal Bihari Vajpayee, but if you asked a businessman, he said, if I had to follow the labor laws of this country, I would not be able to run a business. Basically he's saying, I don't follow the labor laws of this country. Right? And then the land issues, which we talked about, the floor area ratios. I mean, if you drive from here to Delhi, on one side you see all these high rises, and then the other side you see all that sprawl of construction, maximum allowed 5 stories. Why? I mean, in a land scarce country, why would you have the lowest floor area ratio in the world? Now, you say you require some cultural or social or some political dimension to this? I don't think so. This is simple common sense. Land is so scarce, why would you have such a low floor area ratio? And why would you regulate it in this way? Then you come to the capital side, right? We have now the most expensive, the most inefficient banking system in the world. We have a intermediation ratio of 600%, 600 basis points, 6%, same as Russia. So again, it's not. So this is where the unshackling now has to take place in these areas, yeah. So that's why we call it. Let me stop here, and I could go on this theme a
we'll have
bit,
a
but
chance
we'll
to
have
do
a
that.
chance
Yeah,
with some
yeah.
interactions. So
Right.
just wanted to warm you up a little bit on this.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was hoping for, Ajay. Thank you very much. Let me ask Professor Ruchira Sen to share a few thoughts, a few comments with us, and then I'll come to Professor Milindo Chakrabarti as well, and then we'll have an open discussion. So first, Professor Sen.
I just want to check my mic.
Let's go to place.
Yeah.
Oh, now it works. Professor Chhibber, it's an honor to be here, and thank you to JSGP for inviting me. I just want to, the idea of unshackling, Professor Chhibber doesn't say this in the book, but the way I read it is, the idea of development as freedom. Like why do we, and especially since we're talking about where we will be in 2047, Professor Chhibber writes in his book that we need to unshackle India because by 2047, we need to start thinking about will we have an unshackled India. And I'm 35, so in 2047, I think I'll be 60. So 2047 is still in my lifetime. And I am really, really invested in this book for this particular reason, since, if we actually do what Professor Chhibber says, I get to live in well, let's see what kind of economy I get to live in.
Prosperous and happy.
A prosperous and happy economy. So I'm invested. But that's exactly why I think unshackling is interesting, because here we are talking about development as freedom. And why do we develop? My students ask this all the time. I teach at the journalism school. And, often there is this idea of economic growth as something that is desirable just for its own sake, right? And, Professor Chhibber is, he takes a critical perspective to almost everything that he talks about. So this book is in many ways an exercise in critical thinking. When we start to talk about economic growth, why is it desirable? Well, one major reason is because it's freeing. The ultimate goal is to be free. And then comes the idea, what do we want to be free of? We want to be free of poverty, we want to be free of hunger, we also want to enhance our capabilities so that we can actually enjoy the good life. So that's why education becomes so important. So at least I read Unshackling a little differently. But that's why I think this book is also particularly important. And often you will see this in most observers of India. There is a distinct influence of Professor Amrita Sen, which I see here. I may be wrong, but that's how I read it. There are readings and there are readings, so this is my reading. I of course agree with Ruchir Sharma, where he says that this is a big picture book and it's an ambitious book. And often when it comes to writing a big picture book, everyone who has attempted it knows that, when you write a big picture book, the first question your publishers will ask you is, okay, so here are so many themes, but what is your book really about, right? And I'm sure Professor Chhibber has engaged with this question with his publishers also, so I would like to hear more about that. Since I teach at the journalism school, one of the questions that we keep asking, where we look at any piece of writing, whether it's economic, whether it's political, whether it's bureaucratic, whether it's policy, we always ask, who's the audience? So the way I see this book, I think the audience for this book is all India observers, and that would mean, for instance, I would like to gift this book to my father for his birthday, as he is an India observer, and an interested person who would read. And I think that is actually the strength of this book, that it's meant for everybody. If you're a scholar, if you're a policy person, if you're a journalist, I think particularly if you're a journalist, if you're a student, I think this book is a very, very good book for you to read. The other thing that I also really appreciate about the book is the data-driven approach. Because today, the social sciences, and not just the social sciences, but all discourse on the social sciences is going through the empirical revolution. This book is heavily data driven, and what is more important is that it's not just data driven, but it is also critically data driven, which means that, for instance, when Professor Chhibber looks at the ease of doing business data, he's critical of it. He takes into consideration that labor hasn't been talked about, that environment hasn't been talked about, within the index. So even the data sets that we use, we need to keep asking ourselves, where does this data come from? What were the questions that were asked when this data was collected? Which I see that this book does very well. And next, of course, when we start talking about the themes, the idea of unshackling India, also from, well, should we say unshackling India from the state really? Because it isn't really, it isn't necessarily, the idea of less government is necessarily better. I don't really see that. It's very well qualified. The idea is to develop a more capable state, and in that sense, we are unshackling. There's discussion on cash transfers, and not just from the consumer side, but also from the producer side. So I think that would be something we should discuss. Today, we're in Sonipat, and just across the border for the last 1 year, we have been seeing a farmers' protest. And one of the issues that they've raised is the corporatization, the issue of MSPs, and I know the Food Corporation of India has been discussed, as has the procurement system. So I was thinking to throw that up for discussion. What I appreciate when we talk about privatization is that process matters. Essentially, whenever there is any kind of policy, there is a need to build consensus, exercise soft rather than hard power, and that's something I would like to put up for discussion. I really appreciated where we, in the book, there's a categorization of government services by specificity and by volume. There's the idea that governments prefer more specific services because you can then say, you can show more definite results. And that means that education, healthcare is often left in the lurch because you don't often get specific results. I thought that was a very interesting point. And finally, the Indian exceptionalism and the need to break Indian exceptionalism, and to also show that the tools that apply to most other countries also apply here. I thought that was a valuable contribution. And finally, when we start talking about the banking system, and we see the NPAs as a riskless or a stigmatized capitalism, my reading is that we are essentially having at this point some sort of socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. So I'll end with that.
That's very good. Yeah. I like that one.
Thank you.
Excellent, Ruchira. Thank you very much for those incisive comments. I didn't go to journalism school, but when I was being taught on how to communicate effectively, they told me you must have a clear audience, and if you write for everybody, then you write for nobody. But you're saying this book is like for everybody, so I'm going to assume, you can come back and answer it, but I'm going to assume therefore that the author has failed to identify a proper audience. I think I know Ajay well enough just to show that it is fit in. So is Professor Chakrabarti on? Yes. All right. So Milindo, please. So we need. How do we get him on?
So
Please go ahead, Milindo.
I hope I am audible.
Let's see if we can get you on the screen. 1 second. We'll get you on the screen, and you'll have about 7 to 10 minutes to share your reactions.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Milindo, go ahead.
Little louder.
Okay. So thank you. And I must make it very clear that I found the book very interesting, and the way it tried to capture the future path for Indian development in the coming 25 years is very, very, I would say, clearly written, and the most important part that I found in this book is that the authors did not consider any one of these 5 issues that they have considered in while writing this book as singly important, and they have mentioned that these 5 of them are simultaneously playing their roles in deciding as to how we can move forward. We cannot change the role of the state without planning for the future, without re-engineering the economy, without freeing markets and unleashing competition and building the foundation of developing human capital. So these all 5 components are to be taken care of right at the beginning, right at this point, and we have to move forward, taking just not on emphasizing on any one of them, but we have to take care of all 5 components in a simultaneous manner. And this is perhaps the best way to get India onto a level, onto a field where it can accommodate and we can move forward and reduce the gap between those who are at the higher level and where India is now. I have no sort of disagreement on this. I am fully in agreement. But, however, I have a fundamental question that is perhaps missing because it is not considered a part of the main economic argument. Or maybe it requires a little bit of different directional perspective in understanding and capturing. When we are talking about unshackling India, I believe the most important features that are now relevant in the context of unshackling India is to taking care of the caste. The 5 issues are very important from the economic perspective. But in India, you like it or not, over the 3,000-4,000 years, we have followed an economic system where the all fundamental decisions are taken in the name of the casteist perspective of the country as a whole. You may say that, well, we have been able to get 2 of them to some extent, but ultimately, even today, the latest elections that we had in 2021 in the month of March, that also reveals the importance of the caste relations and the caste identification and the relation between the caste level political system and its implementation at the economic level. So in India, even though we tried unshackling India through different methods and different ways, right from the age of Buddha or Mahavir, or even then in the context of the emergence of Sufism or the emergence of the idea of what should I say? I just forgot. Anyway, so his perspective, and then in the context of the British system also, the idea of trusteism, and ultimately converted sometimes into the issue of religion. So these process of caste and religion playing an important role in the economic decision-making process and has played a very important role. And this casteism has also played an important role in making this sort of a bureaucratic system, in making the election commission, in making all sorts of related mechanisms that are required for the expansion of the fundamental structure of the economy has remained very much in practice. So these 5 basic stages proposed by the book is very important, but it has to also take into account the issue of customs. And sometimes the issue of customs becomes more important than the 5 components mentioned by the authors here. So I would like to stop here with a very concrete argument in favor of bringing in the issue of caste and religion-based political and economic system that is being developed, continuing over the years or centuries or even millennia today. So that's all what my interpretations and understanding about this book. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Milindo. Ajay, you probably haven't met Milindo Chakravarti. He's
No.
one of our colleagues in the School of Government and Public Policy.
Okay.
And he's an economist. I think I need to mention that he's an economist. Otherwise, you might not have guessed. But anyway. So what we can do now is, I don't know, Dr. Chhibber, if you are comfortable doing this, we can take 1 or 2 reactions in addition, or would you prefer to react to those? Yeah, if
your
it's in my
hand.
hands, as they would say in the UN. Then let's take maybe 2 reactions. Let's take 2 reactions.
Or I
or
can
so.
respond to these and then come back
Okay,
to, yeah?
that's fine too.
Okay.
Now we see if these answers you.
So, by the time you prepare your questions, let me quickly, to thank you both for your wonderful comments and very useful comments. Yeah, I mean, development as freedom is certainly there, very much part of our thinking, but we didn't want to be tagged as Amartya Sen acolytes. So the language we use is unshackling India from its interventionist state, allowing young aspirational India's innovativeness, flair and talent to be nurtured, blah, 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 blah. So that's the kind of language we use. I do use argumentative also somewhere, but not in the way that Professor Sen probably used it. But anyway, I'm just giving you that. That's the point. On the big picture, yes, I mean, you're right. Actually, as I say in the book, I had written 3-4 books before on economics, which were very technical. And then one day my father, who's now passed away, said to me, Beta, why don't you write a book that I can read and understand? And so I told Salman, my co-author, whose father was a politician, I think, in the Indira Gandhi government, said, why don't you write it for your father and I'll write it for mine? And every sentence I wrote, would my father understand this or not? And we said, we're not going to compromise on the rigor of the literature review, the data analysis, but we want a book that anybody can be able to pick up and read. And that's what we tried. I don't know if we succeeded. And the publisher, of course, we didn't come up with the title, Unshackling India. It was our publisher from HarperCollins, wonderful publisher, editor we had, who said, after we'd written the first draft, said, well, this sounds like you want to unshackle India. And we said, what a great title. So that's where the title, because it's sort of a theme that runs through every part of the book in some way. So that's where that came from. On the farm issues. So I was the World Bank director in Turkey, and in around 2001 they had a big crisis, and they were spending, like we are, huge amounts of money on every subsidy you can think of, fertilizer, water, MSPs, anything you can think of, the same like we have, credit, subsidies, And I said to them, you know, you need to modernize this. A middle income country shouldn't be focusing on individual subsidies like this. What you need to move is from what product based subsidies, which mess up the market, to people based subsidies. You want to protect people, you don't want to protect items, right? And you get stuck in this, like we are stuck in this MSP and water free electricity. The water is getting pumped out. Now I went to IIT Ropar, they told me there's so little water table. Now with all the pesticides, there's a massive cancer crisis in Punjab. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I tried to convince the Turkish authorities. They said, oh, this is not going to work in India, in Turkey, just like our bureaucrats say it's not going to work in India. Their bureaucrats said, this is never going to work here. So the minister was a friend of mine from the World Bank. So I said to him, I can't convince you or your people. Why don't you guys go and visit Mexico or Brazil where they've already tried all this? So he sends a delegation, and for 2-3 weeks, which we arranged, and they come back and they're the ones who tell him, yes, we are going to do it. We are going to do it a Turkish way, but this is a great idea and we've seen it work. And then he tells me, okay, but my agriculture minister, he's from a village. You go and explain all this to him. He's not going to get convinced. So I went to the agriculture minister and I took a passbook with the name of a fictitious farmer. And I said, the new scheme, you will be handing out passbooks to farmers all over the country. You wouldn't believe it. Within 3 months, he had the whole scheme, because now he could see the light bulb went off in his head of votes, right? And within 3 months, they had implemented it. So what I'm trying to say is all middle-income countries move away eventually from product-based subsidies. And we are moving away. DBT is that on the consumer side. But it is an idea which already, the basis for which is there, the PM Kisan scheme. Now, all you need to do, as we propose in the book, is make the PM Kisan scheme 5 times bigger, but don't do it on top of what you already have. Then take away these other subsidies. You will not have to deal with MSP. You will not have rice coming out of your ears. You will not have sugarcane and wheat surpluses that we don't know what to do with, rotting in FCI godowns. Farmers, you end up improving the land cadastral system hugely, because to get that PM Kisan subsidy, already it's happening. The land records improve hugely, and you get much greater risk taking from the farmers, because now they have this base of cash coming into their bank accounts. They know they're not going to starve. They're going to take risks with much higher value crops. So the whole system starts to transform. And
Ajay, before you continue, I just wanted to make sure I catch Ambassador Mohan. He wanted to make a few observations,
Okay.
and then you will continue. Sorry, go.
So thank you very much, and I'm glad my colleague Dean Sudarshan pulled me here. So full disclosure, I hadn't read the book, I'm here by accident. But nevertheless, there was a statement that you made which attracted my attention. Far be it for me to defend my indefensible IAS colleagues. Most of the time they're indefensible anyway. So I'm not here to defend them at all. But some comments based on just the comments that you made. One, I'm convinced, having spent 38 years now in the Foreign Service, that India is a sui generis country. On that, these guys are right. They may be rascals at the end of the day, but I think they're right. And the reason is, I haven't seen a country which has features of developing and least developed all rolled into one country. I challenge you to give me a country. China was somewhere around that, but they have now developed so much that there is no extreme poverty in China to speak of. Whereas I think we have very few areas of India developed, I believe, maybe some gated communities here and there. But we are certainly a least developed country for the large part, but we don't admit it. We keep saying we are developing for 75 years. Parts of India, I've spent 6 years in Congo, by the way, of all places, godforsaken country. But I think Congo was in many ways better than India. In many of the villages that I went to in India, Congo was way better. Less poverty in Congo than India, which is saying a lot. And even today, if you see the people who come to build houses, they live on 2 chapatis and a little bit of hari mirch and salt. What kind of life is that, 2022? So that's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say is I challenge you to give me a country where 600 million people live in abject poverty. This is Niti Aayog. So we're talking 2016, it was 450 because they say 1 in 4 people live. This was the very first report on multidimensional poverty. Finally, Niti Aayog has done something they can be really proud of. Same UNDP model, released November 2021. And it's 1 out of 4 persons live in abject poverty. I'm adding 200 million because there's only one university in the country, Azim Premji University, which says 200 million people joined the poverty, extreme poverty ranks because of the COVID. This report by the Niti Aayog was pre-COVID. So 600 million for sure. Prime Minister's Garib Kalyan Yojana is 800 million for giving 1 kilo of lentils and 5 kilos of grains, food grains, coarse grains.
Yeah.
So we have 800 million. I don't think there is a country like that. And plus 2 things, no security umbrella. Turkey was a NATO member. They didn't have to spend that much on defense. India has got no security umbrella to speak of. So we have to spend on defense. And you've just given us this shocking statistic of how defense is going down. No safety net. Which country of the size of India doesn't have a social safety net? You just leave them on the roads if they lose a job. There's nothing to fall back on. So there I think these guys are right. There is no other path. It may well be possible that they themselves have contributed substantially to this state of affairs. The fact that India is sui generis is very hard to kind of deny. Defense spending is down because you keep spending on MNREGA, for example. Huge expenditure that's going on. The current government said it's not important, but then they have now come right back to it and they're spending more. And my last point is, and really, if you ask me what is the real reason why it is becoming, or it's become so difficult to unshackle India, 2 things. One, we consistently allow bad politics to trump good economics, the farm laws being the classic example. And now there are reports saying the farm laws were sensible. So just, and if a government like the present one with a thumping majority in Lok Sabha can't do anything about it, I worry about it. When we will reform, land, labor, you mentioned. But we're just not capable of reforming because we don't build consensus. Either we don't want to do it or we are incapable of doing it. But for me, outcome is the same. You know, you can keep arguing why this was not possible. They didn't look like farmers to me. You went and saw the people who blocked the roads. They were eating pizzas. They were getting massages done. It's very clear to me funds were coming from outside. But they blocked these sensible bills.
No.
Frankly. So that's, and my last point, we need to grow at 9 to 10%. That is the only savior for India. If we can grow at 9 to 10% GDP in the hope that something will trickle down. Otherwise, I'm not sure the system can do much. But
Mohan,
I stop
yeah,
here.
let's get some responses. I know you.
I don't know if you have the
disagree.
time, but I
If you could stay a few minutes
I
with
hope
us.
you
No,
will
I will
read
wait.
my book because I quite
I
disagree.
think I will read it.
I
Sorry.
quite disagree with many things you just said. So
Okay, well, go ahead and respond.
Then I will read the book.
right now.
He will wait. Yeah.
Well, I mean, for example, on the farm laws, I disagree that they were good farm laws. There were very big flaws in the farm laws, and they were rammed through Parliament without any discussion properly, without any parliamentary debate. The 2 biggest problems with the farm laws were, one, that they would now leave the farmers completely at the mercy of dealing with large buyers.
It was
And-
there in the Congress manifesto.
No, it was, well,
Yeah.
may have been, but then what
was
was the
good
rush?
stuff.
What was the rush? And secondly, the whole arbitration clause that they put in means that you can never be taken to court. So there were huge problems. Now, in my book, we argue that we need to get away from this, but then you need to show farmers a way forward. You can't just pass 3 laws surreptitiously in Parliament and expect people who are now wedded to this system who have no other alternative shown to them, no other vision shown to them, then that they will be just happily giving up all this. So, and while they can talk about outside money and coming in and all, you cannot sustain agitation of this magnitude through a COVID unless you have the whole of this group behind you in some significant way. So I'm sorry, I disagree with that. I also feel that I know I've worked in. Dean Sudarshan's wife comes from Indonesia. You go to parts of Indonesia, it's very similar to any large developing country. Even in Turkey, you went to eastern Turkey in the Kurdish areas, the incomes were like in a low-income African country, and the level of poverty that I saw there. There were people who had not been from their village to a town 20 miles away in their life because they couldn't afford the bus fare. They never had any cash. So there are many parts of the world where it looks like, India. So India is sui generis in its culture, in its history, in its the whole society. But when you want to grow an economy, there are lots of things that you need to learn from others, and to just keep saying we are different and we are sui generis and we have nothing to learn from anybody doesn't make any sense to me, because I've seen how much progress others can make, right? When they pick up ideas and learn from others. So I don't think I'm in agreement with this thesis at all. And I tried to write a book to make that point.
I will pick it up on the
Yeah, thank you.
Right. Should we?
Just a few
you
other
wanted-
points
yeah,
on
okay.
the caste issue.
On the caste issue. That's a
Just
big
one
one,
more, yeah. Okay, so first of all, I should say that it's a different book, and I should. My wife is an expert on caste issues. She's a sociologist, but I should write a book with my wife. But then it might mean the end of my marriage, so I don't think I'll go there. But just to answer a little bit, I do think caste played a very important role in the choices we made in our education policy, for example. The fact that India, in its early stages of development, went in big on higher education and not as much on mass education for everybody. To many people have ascribe it to the Brahmanical sort of, attitude that pervade there. So the neglect of sanitation, open defecation, perhaps the caste system has a lot to do with that as well. That the fact that you didn't need to pay attention because the lower castes were picking up all the shit, so to speak, was may have been, because we don't have so much open defecation next door in Bangladesh even, or even perhaps in Pakistan. I don't know. No, so caste comes in various parts of our analysis, but you may be well right that the caste system is the cause of a lot of our problems, but that's not we have legislated it away. Now that societal change may take some time. It's not an issue that we confront that in that holistic way in the book, but it does seep into different bits of the book in different ways, is all I can say at this point. But otherwise, thank you.
All right, that's great. Let's get a few more reactions. Ruchira, we'll come back to you. I know you want to bring in a few other points, but the floor is open. Let's get some feedback. Who would like to start? Go ahead, Sudeep. And if our colleagues in the second row, you can come to the front and use the mic. Yes, we have Sudeep, we have Subaran, we have Sudarshan. Oh, we have lots. And Naveen, and then we'll come to Divya. So in that order. And then we'll see if we have time for another one.
Okay.
You're generating lots of excitement, it seems. Please.
It's the nature
Thank
of the
you very
topic.
much. I think it is very, very kind of dense subject, and really we need to reflect a lot.
Yeah.
The first thing which I was really trying to think from last time is basically that what picture we are coming up with is a very, very different kind of a paradigm than the typical, standard economics and or say policy making paradigm that we have till now, which is very much this, as we say, this complexity paradigm. That where typical causation won't work. For example, one particular thing causing the other. So in a way, I find in this particular talk and also definitely in the book that it is basically about the interactions between so many different factors, and these interactions are in a way, if I may use that word, entangled with each other. So it is, say for example, this view is also there in even Professor Amartya Sen's various writings. Like Amartya Sen also mentioned is that different kinds of deprivations cannot be addressed individually, because if one deprivation is actually entangled with the others and they aggravate each other. So my really thinking in my really question would be like, what kind of paradigmatic shift we need in policy making to address this kind of a complex world? Because simply saying things that trickle down economics and all of this that we have tried, that won't work. It's very clear. And the second more particular thing is that there is one particular thing which has come up very popularly in policy making nowadays, is behavioral policy making. And we also try to introduce it to our students, like nudge theory. Nudge theory has become so popular, and
What
many
theory?
governments have
Nudge.
also.
Nudge. Remember the book
Nudge,
by Richard
yeah.
Taylor?
Oh, yeah.
Many governments have also tried to adapt that. So can something like that be done in our context too?
Okay, Subram?
Professor Chhibber, I must admit that I did not go through the book as yet, but I did follow your talk yesterday as well as today. So I have two questions. One is coming from the financial market side, because you are mentioning about reform even in the capital sector as well. So with a further drop in the rate of interest offered by banks in bank deposits, provident fund, post offices, the recent announcement by the Honorable Finance Minister, I would guess the inefficiency has further increased. So what are your, let's say, policy recommendations regarding, let's say, in order to enhance, let's say, efficiency in the financial sector? Because just now, Professor Mohan was mentioning about 9 to 10% of GDP growth. And in order to have that, I'm quite sure like we will need, let's say, double-digit growth, if not something around 8 to 9%. And the second question is, like, the subsidy which has been given to, let's say, pesticides as well as various food support schemes and all, has accumulated a huge amount of debt, and public debt I'm talking about. So I was just thinking in terms of like, what's your take on India's public debt in the context of economic growth, given we know like there are two schools of thoughts. One essentially says like to some extent they can benefit growth. On the other hand, the other says like beyond a certain point it is detrimental. So I would like to know your viewpoints on this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Subram. We have a few more, then we'll come back.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's because you're chairing this session, the point occurs to me that when Dr. Naresh Singh did the legal empowerment report, a whole section of it is devoted to what I think the word may have been used in that report are the spoilers. That is, who are the people whose interests are best served by the status quo, keeping things as they are, and how do you then tackle them? Because they have enough power and influence, and one of the ways in which power is exercised is really not so much in getting things done, but in trying to keep things that need to be done outside the agenda of political decision making. Right? So, for instance, even the women's reservation, it's not a big deal. Parliament would easily pass it, but they would make a gesture as if, oh yes, it's important, but there'd be some kind of adjournment and some procedural difficulty that comes along, and all parties go along with that. The anti-corruption initiative, big deal was made, sentiment of the House, resolution passed, an ombudsman, the Lokpal was created, and then it's in the interest of all the political parties, the entire political class, to forget about it and to say some minor reason, oh, we've not got a leader of the opposition, we cannot constitute the commission, and so on. So I think one of the things that your next book, I think, has to tackle are these characters in whose interests the system has been presently working very well. And to think of some ways by which we dislodge them of the power that they wield. I mean, whether it's crony capitalists and so on. So I think that part is needed. I mean, it's about how to unshackle. I mean, what to unshackle is brilliantly and very clearly laid out. But the concern really is how to, because the how to comes up against these people. And another point which Melindo's remarks makes me think about is that somehow our population seems to be prone to a kind of false consciousness. You have demonetization, and then the population thinks they've all sacrificed something, their time, effort, money even, because they are part of some great service to the country. And so this tendency for the exploited to think that the exploiter is the benefactor is rather widespread, which supports child labor, parents sending their children think that the employer of their children is their benefactor because without that person, we will not feed the family. So this has to be countered. Now, in many other countries in the world, this sort of situation has led to revolutions,
Right.
radical transformations, uprisings, and so on. Doesn't happen here. So now, what to do about that is another concern.
Thank you, Dean. I will come to Naveen and then to Divya. But as you mentioned the work that we did on legal empowerment of the poor, it reminds me of a conversation we had with all the PRs in New York, the permanent representatives of countries. And I remember distinctly the ambassador of Singapore saying to me, so Dr. Singh, what you are preaching is revolution. You are talking about legal empowerment of the poor, so you want them to rise up against the establishment. And I said, Ambassador, no. What I'm saying is, if you don't follow legal empowerment of the poor, you will have a revolution on your hands. It reminds me clearly of that, but Navi.
So when your comment on the labor laws resonates with something that we were working on right now. We were looking at the 2014 deregulation of labor laws in Rajasthan, and surprisingly we found nothing, no change at all.
Yes.
Because I think pretty much what you were saying was happening, and we saw that even for very large firms which hire more than 200 workers, the firing rate was surprisingly very high, almost 30%. And we're not talking about firing rates of 5 or 10, we're talking about rates as high as 30%. Right? So, this sort of resonates very well with one of the questions that we were sort of scratching our heads with. What's going on? We talk about labor laws so much, but you see labor laws being released and nothing is happening. Probably they were never followed, and Rajasthan never became differently from the rest of India. And so that's just one of the comments that that came to my mind while hearing. The other thing is about the rapid deindustrialization that is happening in India. Growing at that 8 to 10% level seems to be one of those key things that several of us have raised. So do you think the way around this is to sort of focus on deindustrialization, or should we completely change our focus to, let's say, agriculture? Where, and clearly, a lot of these sectors which are growing very fast, which include apparel, the apparel sector has grown very, very drastically. But
Which sector?
The apparel sector.
Apparel.
Right, but the per worker GPA is barely better than what's in agriculture on average. So would it be better to sort of shift our focus and look back at agriculture, which has been neglected for probably the past 30 years, and the farmers' uprising partly resonates that discontent? Probably is it worth revisiting that again and sort of change the way we look at a development plan?
Excellent. We'll have one more for this round, then we'll take a second round. So, Divya, and you'll get some quick reactions. And then, go ahead, Divya.
So, Professor Chhibber, thank you so much. So, like yesterday, your lecture made me think a lot about what development means and what happiness means. So, as you said, India is marked by like open defecation, sanitation problems, hygiene condition is not good, and the legislative process is sluggish. Even the bureaucratic processes are so sluggish and so slow. And it is unlike many other countries. Not many countries face these issues. So I was thinking, I mean, this is a hypothetical question, but what is one main sector that should be focused on that can probably have cascade effects on all these problems? So education comes to my mind, but education can only like be beneficial once the health and the basic needs are met. So my first question is this. Second question is about happiness. So first of all, not all of us understand what exactly happiness means. And in the Union budget for 2022, they have allocated budget to mental health well-being this time. So this is a dimension that I find missing in development discussions. We are talking about trade, we are talking about labor laws, we are talking about farmers' law, we are talking about all the technical things, but we are not internalizing the development. So that is my question, because if we want to be happy in, say, at the 100th year of India, we should know what happiness means, right? So just if you have any comments on this, yeah. So these are my two questions.
So let Dr. Chhibber respond briefly to these. Then we'll have a second round and then wrap it up. And I'd especially like to encourage students who are here with us to come forward with their questions in the second round. Of course, faculty as well. But Ajay, please.
Yeah, just a few quick reactions. I mean, yes, you're right. I mean, it's the complex, it's trying to understand. So if you think, okay, I got to create jobs, right? That jobs is a very important objective. Everybody thinks that's a great, important objective. But then whenever you read something on job creation, they'll say, why doesn't the government go and create jobs, right? Like, of course, government has a lot of jobs that are not filled at the moment, and the Punjab new chief minister just said, I'm going to fill up 25,000 vacancies and make them pakka, not kacha, you know. And so like that, probably in the government of India, there are someone told me there are 8 lakh unfilled vacancies. So, but if you're just going to fill up these 8 lakh vacancies, you may end up with a lot of more drivers and T-boys and clerical people, etc. So that's not the solution. And in any case, with the scale of job creation required, it's not the government jobs that will be the solution, right? It'll have to be private sector jobs in competitive industries which draw in millions of people, like was done in all these other countries which did go through, you know, the kind of classic Arthur Lewis transformation. So that's where we need to focus, which means less capital intensive investment, more labor intensive investment as well. Or it can be capital intensive if it has enough, linkages to other demand that it creates, which in that ecosystem, that so suppose you say, I'm going to set up a factory that produces aircraft. But if the aircraft factory needs millions of parts, those parts go out and get created in hundreds of thousands of factories or whatever, maybe hundreds of factories in different ways, then, you know, that can be also quite employment intensive. So I think that's kind of what we were trying to push at. I'm not sure nudge theory is required here, because India, for example, when you come to things like vaccination. I mean, there seems to be no resistance here like you find in many other countries, right? So I'm not sure. I think people here do respond pretty well to directives and to incentives. Then, I mean, there are crazy people in India, but they're not as crazy as you find elsewhere in the world. So it seems to me. And then this issue on the financial sector, yeah, I skipped this part yesterday for interest of time, but our book has some very clear ideas on what is needed in the financial sector. We do feel that partial reprivatization of the banking system is needed. We've now consolidated India has now 12 public sector banks. We had about 20 some a year or so ago, but we argue that these could be brought down to at best 4 public sector banks, not less than that, because some of the public sector banks have some regional coverage also. So you do want enough regional coverage. But you do want to remove directed lending requirements from these commercial banks, and then you can establish 1 or 2 banks out of other than these 4 to perform some priority sector lending if you want, but not all of them. Right now we have all banks, private and public, by the way. Then for the medium small enterprises, a Mudra bank already, of course, has been created. But it's also running into problems. It's going to have an NPA problem very soon, because whenever people take money from a public sector bank, they seem to think you don't have to pay it back. And probably a lot of it is also politically directed lending. I think the non-bank financial companies are a good source of financing for the MSME sector. They are anyway the major source of credit to the MSMEs, and their growth should be encouraged. So there should be an AQR of the MSME sector. The bad ones should be shut down and closed up, but the other ones should be encouraged in a big way. The Jan Dhan accounts which have been set up, which are pretty much inactive at the moment, I mean, these are small amounts of money. These could be transferred to the newly established Indian Post Payments Bank. So rather than saddle big commercial banks with having to deal with these, they're not equipped to deal with them. They're a very heavy cost to them. Then this post payments, like a postal bank, more suitable entity for this. And then, as I did say yesterday, the revamping of the functions, the entanglement of the RBI with the government in a variety of ways has to be redone. So that's on that. On this issue of public debt, I did a study on this and I quote it in the book when I was at NIPFP, where we looked at the question that if you borrow for infrastructure, which then crowds in private investment, that can be actually a positive cycle can be created there. And I estimated a complete model, an investment model, and it's a NIPFP working paper which is cited in the book. So you can go back and check the econometrics there, where we showed that if you borrow for this kind of investment, then the crowding in effects of private investment can enhance enough growth that the public debt dynamics don't go out of control, and that you can actually see positive improvements in public debt to the GDP ratio. So, but if you start borrowing for other things, and now of course we have reached a pretty critical point in our public debt because of heavy borrowing for the pandemic, and more importantly for the fact that Mrs. Sitaraman, like a good female finance minister, I would say, who knows how to run the budget, she has cleaned up. You know, she has paid back all those FCI borrowing. So the previous finance minister, for all his skills, was actually hiding what would be called running a quasi-deficit by forcing FCI and other state-owned enterprises to borrow on their behalf. And one of the things she has done during the pandemic is clean all that up, which is a good thing, and which is why also the debt has gone up so much. But we are at a critical point on the debt, and so we would have to borrow now very carefully going forward so that the debt dynamics does not run out. But borrowing for infrastructure spending of the right kind, I think, could be still possible, given that paper that I did. Then you had legal empowerment. Yeah. So the question, I mean, I do agree with you that, I mean, I'm shocked at how quickly explosions take place in other parts of the world when you see the kind of picture that we have here in India. We had such explosions in Latin America in the 70s and the 80s, if you recall, massive strife. Still exists, but somewhat subdued. Then you had the Arab Spring, major, very similar conditions. People get some education, but there are no jobs. Actually, the Human Development Report of 2010 has a lovely picture of how in the Arab world education increased, but unemployment went through the roof. So when you educate people and then you can't even give them jobs, that's the most explosive combination possible. It's surprising. I still think we're going to have it, and I'm surprised that we have less of it. But hopefully there is an alternative. There is the problem of nota. No other, the nota.
No,
Yeah. So the problem I'm seeing is whenever you have an option to present people with a political party that does provide basic health and education and not just visible services of the kind that we were talking about, which I call welfareism, using the framework that Arturo Israel provides, which says that when you have less specific outcomes and you have large number of interventions, then it's better to bring those services to the lowest level of government, closest to the people. And so it explains the puzzle of why we have a pretty well-functioning ISRO or election commission even, or a reserve bank, because they have specific outcomes and low number of transactions. And we can't deliver basic health and services. The puzzle, till I found Arturo's framework, I couldn't understand why these two things can coexist in the same country, right? And that framework does provide an answer. But I do think that if the alternative is available, like we have seen now with our party in Delhi and Punjab, then this sort of problem that we see of people shoving off real reforms can be addressed. And in this, the examples you gave show all parties are complicit on the corruption issue, electoral bond issue, as well as on the women's wage reservation bill. I think even the Congress probably paid some lip service to it, but secretly many Congress MPs were probably quite happy not to have to give up their parliament seat for a woman, right? So that the political system is complicit in this in a major way. The kind of issues you raise, I do think another book is needed, and perhaps you are the one to write it, not me, as well. On deindustrialization, I'm trying to give the message, and you mentioned agriculture as a solution. I do think agriculture is certainly not the solution, because the agriculture already has too many people. And when you compare with any other country, we have the ratio of GDP coming from the sector to the number of people it supports, we have the highest in the world at this time. So agriculture is not in fact, the solution is to get people out of agriculture. Now, Raghuram Rajan recently, to my surprise, says well, let's forget manufacturing completely. We are not never going to be a manufacturing power. So let's just focus on services, which is where we have some runner advantage. But then when I saw his interview, the guy asked him, but it's not going to create enough jobs for all these people with secondary education. Where will they go? And he said, well, they can be cooks, cleaners, service. They provide the services to the IT software engineers, which is really over the top for me. But I asked the question, why do you choose? We are doing well in services, let's push along. Now let's fix the competitiveness problem in the industrial sector. And the competitiveness problem in the industrial sector is partly coming from these laws. But in my book, I also point out certain very specific policies. For example, electricity. I show graphs where you show that the price that producers pay for electricity in India is 35% higher than what consumers pay. And when you compare India's electricity price to the producers, India is uncompetitive. When you compare India's electricity price to consumers, very competitive. We are well below other competing countries. But on the production side, similarly, when you go to rail, we are cross-subsidizing from freight to passenger, right? Okay, maybe there are good reasons for that, but I would be much happier if you paid an explicit subsidy on the consumer side and didn't make your producers uncompetitive by the freight rates you are charging them. We already have huge infrastructure problems. Then I compared petrol and diesel prices, okay, with China. Our petrol and diesel price is 20%, our petrol price is 20% higher than China, and our diesel price is 50% higher than in China. How will you compete? How will your truckers and producers compete, right? So there's a lot of reasons for the cost of doing business being very high in this country. Of course, I feel producers should be paying more taxes, but they're getting socked on some of these costs, while they hide their taxes, of course, at the other end. Now, if you could get them to pay taxes and then not have to cross-subsidize, that would be a better outcome, of course, as well. On happiness, so I think on this, let's not start to choose. We need all sectors humming to create the kind of jobs at 8-10% growth. If you want to grow, you can't do it with agriculture. Agriculture will at best grow from 2 to 3% to 3 to 4%. It's not going to grow faster than that, right? So if you want your whole economy to grow at 8-10%, you're not going to have it through agriculture. It's going to be services growing at 13-14% and manufacturing growing at least 8-9% for the average to come close to 7-8%. And that's where we should push. On happiness, yeah, I mean, so I think, so there are different definitions out there. My favorite one is, of course, the Bhutan's Sudarshan and I, we participated in a very interesting conference there on Beyond the Ballot Box also. It's a lovely little book. But if they have these 8 different aspects which emphasize community, family, social strife, in addition to income and health and education. And you can look it up, what the components of that are. There's a gross happiness index, which is produced mostly by Jeffrey Sachs, but he's kind of combined the UN into that. That's got a lot of indicators also. But in our book, what we talk about and what I think Jamshedji Tata was talking about when he said, I don't want India to be an economic soup. I think what he meant was less unequal, more inclusive, less social strife, less of this casteism, less discrimination against caste or religion, or in a society which is is at peace with itself going forward. Right? That's the kind of happiness that we talk about in our book.
So we'll take a quick round if you don't mind.
Yeah.
We have a few minutes. You have a question as well? Students. Let me start with the students, and then I'll come to other faculty.
Come forward.
Yeah, please.
Use this mic.
I understand and speak.
No, come here, because it's got to go online.
Tell us which course you are following.
I'm in BSSP 21, sir. I'm a first year student.
Well,
So I might not measure up to anyone here. But
No, you do.
on one side, you speak about how important it is to corporatize or privatize government, and you speak about the overpaying of government workers. And on the other end, we have huge income inequalities, as you mentioned. So wouldn't that be a contradiction to itself? How do we actually go ahead with privatization while also reducing the income inequality?
all right, we'll note it. We'll take some more. Thank you very much. Brilliant question. You more than measured up to the faculty.
Okay, my name is Arjun Varma, second year econ. So, three of my grandparents were teachers. Two of them were taught at a government school, one taught at a private school. And one of the main reasons I was really intrigued or interested in getting a government job was when I visited the treasury in a small town in Kerala, and I saw how much my grandmom and grandfather make in a month just for pension. And as I walked in, that discussion about government employees being paid more than market price and also earning a lot in pension. I'm not sure how many government servants are there in the room. I would love to know how much you make in pension. Probably say I can come to you after the conference and ask you personally if you're ready, because it is an interesting topic. You get paid a lot during the tenure of your job, and also you get paid a lot after the tenure of your job, which is, well, it is public money. So your thoughts on that, and also throughout yesterday's conference and today's conference, there has been, I haven't read the book, so I don't know if it's there in the book, but definitely in today's and yesterday's talk, a lack of state-wise critique. That's what I sensed. If there is, okay, when you're trying to critique India's Unshackling India, well, India has many states. What have you gone into critiquing states with certain sectors? That's one. And also, when the entire fact about China, like critiquing China and how China spends a lot of budget on the local level, that's also possible in India. But the issue is, let's say a person at the center who's from BJP, he sends the money to a person in the on the municipal level who's probably serving another master of another party. The point is, China has a consistency at all levels when it comes to party politics. India doesn't. So how can, when you're talking about unshackling India, how can that particular phenomenon be accommodated in a federal system like ours, which is very diverse?
Very good. Any other student? Yeah, please.
Yeah, Shakil. My name is Mukund Kishore. I'm a second year economics student as well. So Arjun mentioned certain states may need certain other methods to unshackle themselves. So as a student, employment is a great issue in India as well. So in certain states like Punjab, the immigration mindset is so strong that basic education might not be enough to unshackle to generate jobs in the future by 2047 let's say. So how do we generate jobs now, not only in manufacturing but also social skills, just skills and services in Punjab or in Haryana, unlike manufacturing, which is, there are manufacturing beds in Haryana and Punjab but not offices apart from Gurgaon, and everyone has to travel to Gurgaon for that, which is not feasible for everyone in Punjab or Haryana. So
Very good. Did we have some faculty? Namesh, did you have? Yeah, please go ahead. and then we'll come to Devajit, and then, oh, we have two at the back? Okay, come forward. All right. Go ahead, Ramesh. Oh, we have another student? Anisha, please.
I had a very specific question with respect to
Come,
urban sprawl.
So what?
So in your book, you mentioned about you mentioned about high FAR to be the
Yeah.
solution to urban sprawl and informal urbanization. So my argument is what I think is most of the urban sprawl, as you see, is because of informal urbanization or people from the middle class or lower classes of the society coming from rural areas, migrating to urban areas in search of jobs, or because they do not get, or they're not able to access homes that are there in the center of the city, thus they are forced to stay on the outskirts. So on one side, when we're talking of high FAR, that is building high rises, how do we think people from those sections of the society can afford them? So for example, when we think of housing that was built under the Rajiv Awas Yojana for resettlement of slum dwellers, there have been extensive studies that have shown that slum communities were not eager enough to shift to those high rises because of many issues, including that of moving from the center of the city to the outskirts where most of these units were mostly built. And at the same time, there were also studies, I think it was done by an independent agency sometime in 2016, which actually said that more than 1.5 million houses in such kind of high rises remain vacant throughout the country. So do you actually think building more houses under high FAR might solve the problem for urbanization?
Yeah, okay. That's our student. Is it Anisha? Then we come to Devajit and the two colleagues, and then we wrap it up, right?
So my
You
name
will
is
also, okay.
My name is Anisha from JSGP. You talked about industrialization and deindustrialization, and a developed country like the USA has reached an optimal point where it balances both the concepts efficiently. So what would you recommend India works on to reach that 8 to 10% of GDP in the future?
Okay. So we have to be just as brief, Anisha. Very disciplined. Brief questions, and then we'll have a.
I'm Mathura. I'm also from second year economics. So my question is that yesterday you mentioned in order to truly unshackle India, we have to start giving more power to our local authorities. But in a country like ours, where we are still major on power-hungry politics, do you think that our center is humble enough to actually give that power to our local authorities, which perhaps has worked in countries like Finland? But I don't know if in a country like India, our center is ready to do that yet.
Thanks, Madhura. Devajit, then we'll go to this one.
So, basically, Professor Chhibber, you were talking about different kind of reforms, specifically the different institutional reforms like land, labor, capital, all these things. So it's quite clear that there are different level of say market or government failures. And now we have again talked about something like say less state capacity, right? So it seems that there are some kind of diversion in the policy making, and these diversions are coming from some kind of political nexus between the political class and the business class, right? So if it is there, then the best thing that we can think of in terms of reforms, then specifically the electoral reform first, and then so there should be some kind of sequencing, right? So without the sequencing, so whenever you are trying to implement any kind of policy, that is going to fail. Maybe due to less state capacity or maybe less eagerness of the state to implement those reforms. So maybe if you can reflect on something on the electoral reform points, then it may make a much clearer idea that which kind of policy reforms you are talking about, or maybe which kind of policy reform can work.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Devajit. In fact, that question I wanted to pose myself. In the book, you speak about India being an electocracy rather than a democracy. So how do we make the transition from electocracy to democracy?
Back to democracy.
Let's take these three brief questions here, and none of these. You go ahead first. Yes. Take one of those, right? Please introduce yourself as well.
Good evening, Professor.
sir. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Sharanya from second year JSG Economics. My question is that, like you've been mentioning throughout through the book and through yesterday's lecture about decentralization and giving power to the local authorities, I think another way of approaching prosperity and unshackling India would be through international affairs and just the relations we have with other countries to probably overcome our struggles with the international trade and maybe working towards improving our industrial sector, considering we have so many resources and so many opportunities in that aspect, and we have a lot of human resources. We can probably grow our market and just improve the economy through that aspect. And what I just like to know your thoughts on that.
What aspect? International.
International relations, our relations with other countries, or especially in Asia. So I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
Okay, so
I think he has a lot of questions.
no.
Not going to answer all of them anyway. So.
No, they are contributing to the. It's just Q&A. It's a conversation.
So I'll make your life easier. I won't ask questions. I just have some suggestions. So.
You want to answer the questions? Very good.
No, just a suggestion. So basically, I wasn't there in a talk yesterday because I was giving a training. That's like, I missed your talk, but definitely, and I must admit, I haven't read your book either, but I just went through your contents and a thought came to my mind was that we are talking here about, kind of shackling India, but don't we really need to shackle the ideology of people who are in power and in position? So I'm coming from that, from the a thought of people who are in power, who are in position. Do they really want to give up whatever we were talking about, like the government, the sarkari naukri? The salary is honestly not that much, personally, I feel. 50,000 is not a lot of money. Again, it's not.
I got 15, others get more.
Okay, yeah. So I look at the perks, right? You already mentioned, जो साथ में मिलता है वो बहुत ज़्यादा होता है, and that's why a lot of people, the youth, wants to go into the government services because they want that power, that position. But when they enter the services, they have a different ideology. They want to do so many things for India, but when towards their retirement age, everything goes down the drain. So don't we really need to work on that youth who's basically entering? So that's the ideology, shackling the ideology. I felt that we really need that in our youth and the people who are in power and position. And second is more of a addition to Arjun's question where he talked about, he specifically talked about Kerala. And me being a health economist, I've been doing a lot of study in comparing Indian states. So we have to learn a lot from India itself. Like we definitely have a lot to take from other nations, and definitely we need to be less apprehensive, and so we need to come out of that thing that India, we can't do that in India. But within India, we have so many role models for some sector. So for example, I remember this paper where we compared, there was a paper on health where we looked at Tamil Nadu, and we compared different states of Tamil Nadu. Different states of India with Tamil Nadu in the health sector, in child stunting, for example. And we tried to say, okay, what is that other state lacking compared to Tamil Nadu? So my suggestion is for you, because you had a question. If you could be more specific, for every sector, we would be having a different state. So Punjab is a rich state otherwise, but it might have other issues. So what we really need to take away, the good points from the states that we can take away, and obviously we need to work on the bad points. So that's the only suggestion. Yeah.
All right. So last one.
Like last time, like yesterday.
Yeah, this guy, also he likes to ask the last question.
No, I just sort of. Sorry. This is okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So this one. Yeah, no, just to sort of, and maybe you could sign off by commenting on that, sort of taking on the Dean's point about people not voting their true interests and so on, and then what Naveen is talking about in terms of taking agriculture seriously. I think there is a deeper point here in the sense that we now have a welfare system. India now has a welfare system which is basically very good
at sort of putting some sort of a floor on how much degraded you can be. But at the same time, it also puts a ceiling on what you can aspire to be. So I bring this up because there's been a lot of writing about the elections, and one of the things that's come across, caste and all of that is important, but the welfare that is being channeled, solved, whatever. People, for a lot of people, that was good enough. I got this amount of support. That is good enough. Why should I ask for something else? Now, then the question is, but at the same time, it puts a ceiling on your aspirations, risk taking, and things like that. The sort of stuff that you want to see for people to get out of agriculture and then go to the cities, industrialization, and all of that. So the question is, there are two ways you can go from here, right? So you can either go towards a more institutionalized welfare system like Scandinavia, but that's not possible because that's very expensive. Or you could go to the United States way, right? So where you make it's welfare conditional on whether you're looking for work and stuff like that. So make it extremely conditional. Neither seems like, so the question of course is there a politics that can take us in either of these directions? And if not, then I think the question about doing something about agriculture becomes very, very important, like finding something within agriculture. So I just wanted to put that.
Well, Ajay, our time is very short, of course, but if you can sort of give some broad reactions, you might not have time for all the specific questions. So over to you.
So just quick so first of all, let me say, I talked about international comparisons a lot, but the book is riddled with interstate comparisons, okay? And the book picks up where positive examples could be found. The book does that in spades. In health, we cite not just Kerala, but also both Tamil Nadu and Himachal, both doing very well. So, I mean, the book is actually riddled with examples of things that states can learn from each other, or mistakes to avoid even, let me put it that way. So do go through it and you'll find plenty there. On the issue of privatization, corporatization and inequality, so the evidence is quite the opposite. The state-owned enterprises have been bleeding resources, public sector banks, bleeding resources from the government. We had spent more on, the accumulated losses on Air India were larger than our health spending. So think about it, that if we don't have Air India and it's whatever 20, 30,000 employees, and we just shut it all down, we would have 30 years ago, instead of having it run for the last 30 years, we could have poured all that money into health in a much more significant way, right? So I'm just giving you one example, but it's riddled with it. Secondly, in our book, we studied, there was a very brief period under Atal Bihari Vajpayee government when Mr. Arun Shourie was the they call it disinvestment in India. Only recently we've started using the term privatization. So he disinvested 30 companies, and he's still paying the price for it, so they keep dragging him into court for that. But of those 30 companies, I analyzed them very carefully. 12 companies were genuinely producing companies, manufacturing companies, right? Including Maruti. And I listed the 12 companies in the book. And the rest were mainly hotels and basically sold off for land and things like that. Anyway, for those 12 companies, then we tracked their performance from the time they were sold till now. And we found huge improvements in the financials of those companies, in the productivity indicators, and in the amount of employment that they had generated as well. So I don't think getting rid of a lot of these state-owned enterprises, you will be unlocking this locked up inefficiently used capital and land associated with it in huge ways that might end up creating far more jobs than the few jobs that these companies ever create. So I think there's a huge unshackling that needs to be done right there, that we have documented now, that with the evidence from those companies that were earlier privatized. There was the question on the urban sprawl, urbanization. Yeah, so I mean, I'm not saying the floor area ratio is the only solution. And of course, this very haphazard urbanization has happened because, yes, unlike China, we don't have that, we can't issue people cards. You know, in China, you can't just show up from the rural areas to the urban areas unless you have that particular migration card. And here, there's no control, right? So you will have the sprawl. But I'm not suggesting that the floor area ratio will solve that problem, but that problem will be there. But if you change the floor area ratio, you will certainly end up with much to populate a certain number of people. You will use much less land. There's no doubt about it, right? Now the question is to what do you want to plan for? You want to plan then for the services that will be required. You want the electricity, the water, the sewage, you know, that associated with high-rise buildings. And that's what we need to focus on rather than. Now, there's a proposal that I have just been reading. It's not in my book, where you're right. I mean, suppose you get somebody from a slum and you give them a apartment. What's to stop them of selling that apartment and going back to the slum tomorrow, right? You'd think people are happy to have an apartment, but people may think differently. Let me cash out here and go back. Well, then you can lease it to them. They can't then just walk away. I mean, there's pay a lease and stay there. You can also stop buying land and you can start leasing land. Now, the Chandrababa Naidu started to think about that process for Amravati, the new capital of, is it Andhra or Telangana? Andhra. And then I don't know what happened. Then the government lost, and now this new government has gone all over the place. Can't fully understand. Again, yeah. But I do think, you know, if I was a landowner in, say, Gurgaon, and all these people came and said, we'll buy your land. But if I had the option to lease it to them for even 100 years and not lose the rights, the patta to the land, I would prefer that, right? But also it would solve this problem that if you give people a whoosh of money in one go, then half of it disappears in unproductive ways in any case. So they got, monthly payments, or even 6 monthly payments, or whatever. The lease, you still own the land. Your grandchildren will still have it, and yet you are getting income from that land. And so I think many solutions are possible. I only focused on the floor area ratio because that's easy to compare. But a good urban expert would be able to get into a lot of this in much more detail than I can. Immigration mindset, manufacturing. So while I grew up in Haryana, I was actually born in Ludhiana. And I was born in a town which was very heavily industrialized, a city. It had the Munjals even then, the Hero Honda was there, but it had a whole slew of other it was a pretty strong industrial city at one point. Much of that has migrated to the south now, to Chennai mostly, or Coimbatore. Because I think the farm policy has made land so expensive, and labor laws have then added to the problems as well, that it's very hard to sustain manufacturing, especially if you're sitting in an inland location so far away from, very hard to export sitting in Ludhiana. So I don't know how the Hero people still manage to do it. but I think they mainly make chains and all in Ludhiana now, and actually the assembly is done somewhere else. So we we have to think systematically a little bit about what kind of industries are suited now for landlocked state like Haryana, far away from export points, etc. But I do think that not to give up on it completely. And it's not going to be like overnight you're going to get jobs in Haryana, Punjab. You're going to have to, work on it over a period of time to get the right level of jobs. But it can't. I don't think the solution is only. So it could be a lot of agro processing, but you have to go out of the mindset of just farming, and it could be very high levels of agro processing, which could then be also used for the national market, but also internationally exported as well. I know paper making, this packaging material. These are lots of industries that are potentially possible in places like Punjab and Haryana also. Anyway, we can go into more detail if you want. But now why would they give up their money to the local people? Nobody is going to give it up. It's the Finance Commission that should go after it and make the recommendations. I think they've been too timid. Well, they did. The Y.V. Reddy Commission did transfer to the states, and then the other commissions have been timidly adding a little bit to the local side. But I think they need to go much bolder. And perhaps there will be a finance commission that will go in that direction. At least they should make the recommendation and have the central government reject it. But if you have a finance commission chairman who first tries to figure out what will be acceptable and then makes those recommendations, that's this sort of very timid approach forward may not work. But I don't know, I'm not the right person to know what's the right way to do this in this bureaucratic setup. But that's where the Finance Commission will have to, in the end, put much more pressure on the system to be in a more devolutionary manner. I do think that more experimentation. So when I was in government, I saw so many central schemes. Every day they would announce, this scheme, that scheme. Everything would come with a central blueprint. Like somebody in Delhi would sit down and make a scheme for the whole country. The country is so diverse. What will work in Kerala, what will work in Karnataka, it's not going to work in Jharkhand or in Nagaland or somewhere else, right? So, simple answer. Make block grants and tell them, why don't you, under this broad framework, design your own schemes? Whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's whatever, the scheme happens to be, or the Anganwadi's system, etc. But this idea that you will have a blueprint and everybody will follow this blueprint is absurd in a country which is more diverse than the European Union. So that's where we recommend that we need to go. It doesn't mean that you're going to break up the country. It just means you're going to allow experimentation and then more of the positive learning that you were talking about, because somebody like, I think Telangana came up with the Rai Bahadur scheme, which then now became the PM Kisan scheme, right? And also there were forerunners to the Ayushman Bharat scheme. So like that, we need much greater experimentation going on in different parts of the country. And then when it works somewhere, then see whether you can adopt that in another part of the country. So, and then lastly on international relations, I think it's not international relations. I do think we need to become a much more export-oriented economy. We are still we are probably 5th, 6th largest economy in the world, but we are probably the 18th or the 19th trading economy in the world. And we have had an expansion of exports after the 91 liberalization, but then it stalled. The latest numbers look pretty good. Mr. Goyal announced something like 400 million of exports now he expects this year. But 400 billion, sorry, and I think we need to go to 1 trillion at least. And but we're not going to do that by putting import tariffs, because imports, intermediate inputs are required to be able to produce exports cheaply. So if you make yourself uncompetitive by putting tariff on some of the vital imports you will need, then I don't know how you're going to export, right? So that is all explained in the book in quite excruciating detail in the chapter on trade. I call it strategic trade and industrial policy, but I think it applies to services also. Anyway, we can go there. So I think that's all, right?
More or less.
More or less. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So
Electrocracy versus democracy, you said.
yeah, the transition that and the reforms that. How do you get there to democracy?
So this is beyond the ballot box, that we think of democracy as, well, holding an election. And I think the more we devolve, the more democratic we will get, because now money will be spent and raised more where the people are.
Mm.
And right now you have this remote system, right? You have all your taxes coming to the center, and then the center gives this much to the states, and then so there's no direct link between your service and your tax. And I think the more we went in that direction, but that's not the only way. When we talk about democracy, I think this suppression of civil society, this must stop. The control over the media, this must be addressed. There are lots of issues to be a democratic country that I think Dean Sudarshan is more capable of explaining than I am.
Right.
But I would follow his advice on this
Okay,
issue.
we'll invite him to do a lecture on that at some point. So let me just thank everybody for coming out. I found this really kind of a delightful session. We had a lot of engagement. Especially, I want to thank the students for very articulate questions. That was amazing. Yeah, this was good. The way you put your questions, they were sharp, they were clear. I wish some of the faculty would learn from you. But Dean, thank you very much for getting Dr. Chhibber to join us. Geeta, Shivangi is not here. Please convey our thanks for organizing all of this. Of course, our technical people, Lalit is still here. Please convey our thanks as well to Mani and to all of you, especially Dr. Chhibber, for joining us. This was
Thank
wonderful.
you, Naresh, for chairing it, and to the team for putting it together. Thank you so much. And the questions were, I've never had such great questions in any session anywhere in the world on this book.
But thank you for engaging us for 2 days, right?
And for 2 hours it's happening.
And answering everything. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Wonderful to